So this past week, the Venerable Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, Blaise Cupich, published an article that put into words sentiments that could easily have described my perception of traditional Catholicism or what the church was like prior to Vatican II, at a time in my faith journey where I hadn't really studied the issue, but still felt kind of entitled to strong opinions on the matter. I think I was ignorant of how much of the modern and liberal democratic school of thought I had merely absorbed as a child of this age, and the kinds of prejudices it instilled in me against the world prior to the French Revolution. Because we've all seen movies or read novels that left us with the impression of an authoritarian, oppressive world filled with not only severe economic, but also social inequality as well. And Cardinal Cupich does a good job of kind of vaguely describing the things we've been raised to detest in those olden times when the church was helpless to prevent the sensibilities of aristocracy and opulence and material spectacle to infect the forms of worship that were common then, even to the point of allowing our liturgy to take on the decorum of royal courts where Baroque ornamentation and needless gestures of honor paid to superiors was commonplace. He goes on in his article to explain that Vatican II restored the more ancient practices and comportment to the liturgy and the church's culture so that it wasn't needlessly trapped in the sensibilities of the age of aristocracy that has long since ended. Now we can finally enjoy the faith as it was prior to all that nonsense, and in a way that is coincidentally much more compatible with the modern world as well, which is just an obvious bonus. And again, I clearly remember that being my assumption, especially early in my conversion. It was obvious to me that Jesus identified with the poor and the common people. So why would the offices of the church resemble aristocratic nobility with their titles and their rings, their thrones, and their finery? Obviously, this was a result of the church allowing itself to be wedded to the age of aristocracy or feudalism, which it is only now starting to recover from. Cupich actually claims that the church was wrong to allow these accretions into its culture and liturgy, and that more recent changes were a correction against what he calls actual errors. And this seems to me to be one of the stronger rhetorical maneuvers against traditional Catholicism. If you can isolate its defining features to a time period that was 1,000 years or more after the time of Jesus and claim that these were accidental to the true faith and should be set aside as medieval novelties, then it becomes harder for trads to hold on to them as if they were essential to the faith. But if you sympathize with this claim and these arguments and you find them persuasive, if you aren't careful, you run into some pretty serious and glaring problems. If the church was wrong in the Middle Ages and during the Baroque period, if it negligently allowed worldly sensibilities of those times to infect its liturgical expressions and piety, leading people away from true piety and worship, then how do we know it isn't doing the exact same thing right now? If the church could be wrong then, it could still be wrong today. In fact, it could be wrong at all times. If the Holy Spirit wasn't protecting it from such grave mistakes from a period spanning almost 1,000 years, why should we have any confidence in the church's ability to successfully navigate the temptations of the modern world, which suffers, I would argue, from much more persuasive forms of propaganda and incentivizing than anything that was available in the Middle Ages? So why should we trust the church today? How do we know it isn't making the exact same error by wedding itself to the worldly sentiments of the current age of egalitarianism? When Cardinal Cupich says that the new liturgy is a correction because it promotes active participation in the laity, an active participation that has often blurred the lines between clergy and laity, how do we know that he hasn't unknowingly adopted the assumptions of the French Revolution's égalité? The answer is, unfortunately, we can't. If it erred then it really has no divine protection ensuring that the church doesn't lead the people of faith astray. And a liturgy that promotes worldly injustice while obscuring the apostolic faith would be a critical failure of the church, unless it never actually erred at all. Unless when the Council of Trent codified that liturgy, it did it knowing that it was a legitimate liturgical expression of the true Christian faith. And I'd argue we have good reason to think that's the case. Both that the Venerable Cardinal and many churchmen like him are mistaken in having unwittingly integrated the assumptions of the liberal age into their perception of history and liturgy, and also that the church has always viewed its participation in the life of Christ as a participation in a kingdom. It wasn't medieval royal courts imposing this idea and its embodied expressions. It was Christ himself. We like to talk about the gospel, right? Have you heard the gospel? This is one of the ways in which Protestant vernacular has become more commonplace in the Catholic Church. But Jesus rarely used that phrasing to describe what he was here to do or what he was about. He used it like something like 4 to 5 times, depending on how you count it with the repetitions from one gospel to the next. But he did use the phrase, the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, over 80 times. Jesus came to usher in a kingdom of which he would be the king. Now, that isn't understood as a temporal kingdom, but it does mean that royal imagery is and should be replete in our spirituality, including our liturgy. Jesus didn't come here to be our pal or our democratic representative. He came to rule in his rightful place as king. And yes, he did tell the apostles that he no longer calls them servants, but friends. But it would be a goofy idea or to think that he was demoting himself from his kingship. What was actually happening was that the apostles were being promoted into the kingdom. In Luke 22:29, he confers on them a kingdom and tells them that they will rule the 12 tribes of Israel from thrones. The difficulty comes in the fact that Christ's kingdom is one in which the rulers don't lord it over their subjects. So some people can't reconcile that with the idea of rulers or kingdoms at all. But the church has always exemplified that you can have both. You can have people in authority who rule from seats of authority, who glorify God with beautiful worship, enhanced by sophisticated art, music, and design, but who also are humble, who serve the people, who sacrifice their lives as shepherds. Churchmen like His Eminence Cardinal Cupich don't seem to be able to think in those dimensions. It's one or the other. Humility and royalty can't coexist in their minds, but Christ the King proves that they can and do, and that the church as his living body must also conform itself to his royal standing as priest, prophet, and king. I also take some exception to this idea that seems to be popular among clerics and theologians like Cardinal Cupich, that the modern age is just better. It's progressive, it's freer and more egalitarian, and that the aristocratic sensibilities of the Middle Ages represent inequality and unjust tyranny. I think we can all agree there were problems with feudalism, but there are just as many, if not more alarming problems with the world we live in today that the church should be just as eager to avoid. But consider the fact that leaders today, whether political or economic, control wealth and power at a scale compared to everyone else that was unthinkable during the imperial and aristocratic ages. The gap between the super wealthy and the working population is far greater today than it was in anything we saw in the past. No stereotypical king could have ever imagined the absolute power to conscript all of his subjects the way that Napoleon did, the way that Wilson did, the way that Roosevelt did, and the way Trump could today if another world war broke out, or really any reason he can conceive of. The absolute enormity of power and wealth exercised by today's leaders was unheard of in the medieval world. If your king wanted to exert authority over you as like a working class subject, he'd have to go through the church, who legitimized his authority and who imposed sanctions on those who violated the common good. He'd have to go through local lords who often had wealth and military might that rivaled the king's himself. He'd have to go through parishes, through guilds, through all these structures that created a complex web of integrated life in those days, all of which was swept away by the revolutionary legislation like the Le Chapelier law during the French Revolution. I think we should be much more concerned about the dangers of the modern world creeping into the life of the church than we are about expelling supposed aristocratic expressions that have overstayed their welcome. And come on, let's be more honest here. People like Cardinal Cupich will claim that we've done away with all that, but he still has a coat of arms. He still walks around in expensive robes. He still lives in a bishop's mansion in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood, with some estimates evaluating it at around $20 million. He still has a gold ring that represents his office. He still has titles like Your Excellency and Your Eminence, and he still possesses binding authority over Catholic subjects in his archdiocese. When you're at the very top of a hierarchical organization like that, it's easy to sweep away obligations that bind you to the past and benefit the people. If he's really committed to removing supposed medieval influences from the church, it's surprising it doesn't start with all the honors, power, wealth, and authority that he benefits from. But instead of campaigning for the confiscation of the privileges that are uniquely his own, he's focusing on the privileges of the common Catholic, who is attached to their cultural and spiritual inheritance. He doesn't mind retaining the riches of his his position, but he is happy to take away the riches of the common people, which is what a beautiful liturgy provides to them. Something else that caught my eye in his editorial was this accusation that the older forms of liturgy had become a spectacle, a needless spectacle, with again the remedy being what he calls the simple, dignified version of the Reformed liturgy. But by simple dignity, does he mean what goes on at this parish in his archdiocese?
Huh? Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Come on, sing with us. Here we go.
Celebrate good times. Come on!
Or perhaps on this occasion in which the cardinal himself invited a costumed dragon performer out to be blessed by him personally in his liturgical vestments with wording that was entirely foreign to what a Catholic blessing should look like. I would say that the glaring inconsistency between what he claims and what he does make it really hard to give him the benefit of the doubt and to take his argument seriously. One might be tempted to draw from one of the most famous misquotes of his generation, in which St. Francis supposedly said, "Preach the gospel at all times and only when necessary use words." Or perhaps when St. Teresa of Calcutta didn't say, "If you want to change the world, start with yourself." This generation of activist bishops seem to be more intent on imposing sanctions on everyone until those sanctions arrive at their own doorstep. Then suddenly the benefices of the age of aristocracy start to look pretty good. But only good for the bishop, not, of course, for the people. And maybe that's unfair. I obviously can't judge his heart, but I do think I can judge his arguments, and I find them unconvincing and without support, or just simply inaccurate. And if that isn't enough, the Council of Trent clearly denounces this kind of nonsense when it says, "If anyone saith that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs which the Catholic Church makes use of in the celebration of masses are incentives to impiety rather than offices of piety, let him be anathema." To claim that the Church allowed expressions or modes of worship that would lead the faithful astray to creep into its liturgy is literally heretical, according to the extraordinary magisterium of the Council of Trent. Now, I'm just a simple layperson. I can't say who is and who isn't a heretic, but I would encourage the Venerable Cardinal Archbishop to maybe have a qualified theologian look over his work before he publishes it in public, in case someone who actually has the authority to make that judgment sees it. Okay, thanks for watching that. I hope that was a blessing to you, that it encouraged you and edified you in your journey with the Lord. And if it did, and if you want to support the work that we're doing as a result, which thank you so much for considering that, because we really do need your help to make this viable. Then there's a few ways you can do that. You can go to brianholdsworth.ca/help, which is obviously my website. And there's some options there. One is to just contribute through my website. The other would be to join us over on Locals, where you can interact with me and other like-minded people. You can gain access to exclusive content, where we're doing live streams and I'm uploading videos and things like that. But we're also doing a secret philosophy study with a secret philosopher academic who's joining us once a month to take us through difficult texts that we want to read on our own, but we need some clarification and some guidance on that. So right now we're working through some works by St. Thomas Aquinas with him, and he's a Thomistic philosopher. So if that's interesting to you, join me on brianholdsworth.locals.com. And again, you can check out my website at brianholdsworth.ca/help.